ladies, my distinguished seniors, colleagues, friends. I feel really overwhelmed today to see so many dignitaries around, and it's my privilege to share some of my views on the Nepal development update. Let me first thank the World Bank for coming up with such a very brilliant report, which sheds light on several aspects of the Nepalese economy, right from policies to regulations to structural shifts, and then the binding constraints for development that we are envisaging. We may have some differences in the approaches to see the same thing. It usually happens depending upon which institution you represent and which institution you are working in. But we have the same goal, same objective, and we work for the same kind of vision that we have to translate into actions and get realized. This report also does the same thing. Our common goal, prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali, a country that must graduate from the LDC status and reach to middle income country, and jobs should be created sufficient for the new entrants in the labor market, and we must be a modern Nepal through transformational policies which includes several areas of the economy and sectors. As usual, we have our own approaches with the World Bank. World Bank is very cautious on growth, as usual, as Chimao you already expressed. And you give us the floor. Obviously, we get the floor from the World Bank as to how much we can grow. But we have to grow more. So we expect the ceiling we want to hit. So there lies the actual growth between what World Bank gives the floor and what ceiling we want to hit. So we are somewhere in between. This has been for almost several decades. So is the case in this report. But the reverse thing is that when it comes to governance, World Bank wants us, for good reason, to give us the ceiling. But we want to meet the floor at least to see that we have some room to accommodate in between. So this is the issue of having the ceiling and floors. So this is what about the report in brief. I do agree on this on the outlook that the World Bank report has shown for the medium term for Nepal. In particular, the growth outlook. I will be discussing the binding constraints and the downside risks that we have unless we do the reforms. If we sustain the medium-sized growth, 6% or more, will it reach middle-income country after several years? We may be able to graduate from LDC even achieving 7% growth in due time, but to really emerge as a middle-income country having per capita income of at least $5,000, we need to grow more. And we need to also see what are the binding constraints to pursue that growth and still to achieve and sustain the growth, having its own implication in the economy in terms of better distribution and also creation of the jobs. So a very inclusive, job-intensive, balanced, and then sustainable growth we are talking through this report. The binding constraints, I think the report very much highlights on the macro front, on the sectoral front. They are also in the financial and institutional fronts, and to some extent also on the external fronts. The macro constraints, we all know, every day we get a story about the deficit, touching 37%, touching 38%, touching 40%. Why trade deficit is bound to increase? That's the structural issue. This is not a new thing, but I must recall today here that the pattern of production we have, the structure of production we have in the economy makes us to depend on imports to our growth for some time, if it is to be led by accumulation of capital. Because we have to import capital goods. And when we are importing capital goods, trade deficit is bound to grow, at least the merchandise deficit. And the kind of output we grow is, if it is mostly untradable, we consume at home, like some of the telecom services we are using, automobiles we have been using, some of the things we have been using not being linked to exports. That's bound to create wider trade deficit. That's the worry we have. And I don't get immediate solution to see that our trade deficit is really narrow to be below 20% of GDP. It's really a hard task to do when we are intending to grow by higher capital accumulation. That's the key challenge we have. Now, what's the alternative? Productivity growth. We must raise productivity of capital, productivity of labor, we must introduce technology, and we must better manage our companies, our enterprises, and we must also transform our industrial relations to a new one. How fast that is possible? Access to technology, unless we invest more and unless the global barriers to transfer of technology are over, we cannot really have a leapfrogging into the technological aspect. This is one major challenge we must discuss about the transformation, to remove the binding constraint for productivity growth, which would ultimately help us to have grown faster without necessarily incurring huge trade deficit. This is one aspect I would like to share. The other aspect is the external sector, which is in general driven by trade deficit. When I'm talking about the current account and then the balance of payment stress we may have. If we spend more in the public finance side, without necessarily also generating exportable items from the private sector, the current account deficit would be in stress, our reserves would be in stress, and even if we are so cautious, even if we are so disciplined in the fiscal front, we may fall in another trap, which is the foreign exchange trap. If big investments have to come and we have to serve the principal and then the dividend and then the other payoffs, perhaps the foreign exchange constraint would also be there. At the moment, our reserves close to 9 months of our imports, they are sufficient. But should we multiply our investment in a scale that is necessary to generate double-digit growth, I think our reserves could also fall short of the requirement. This is one area we have to discuss in terms of binding constraints. The sectoral issues. We have a legacy that government has to do many of the economic activities, and in the past we also have the kind of crowd out effect in several sectoral activities. Now we say we have to crowd in. That simply implies that we have to be complementary, the public and the private sector. That includes cooperative and community sectors in our country. I will speak a bit more on that at a later stage. But if we say that if we have to bring in private sector in several areas in a federal setup, this education has to go also to the provincial and local governments. Now that we have new governments, 761 of them, many of them want to do many of the things themselves. They think that government's job is to do and to deliver every services. Time has come that we have to educate everybody that there are jobs for the government to do and we have enough jobs to do to deliver, but don't try to crowd out the opportunities that we can do in a business model driven by the private sector. That's what we think. We need some more time to educate ourselves and see that it really happens at the sub-national level also, if it has been done at the national level. Some of the sectors need more legal and regulatory reforms. The report talks about easing some of the sectors and opening some of the sectors. But I do remind all of you here that we have opened up several areas even these days. Take for example our open sky policy. Just a couple of months before we said that new airlines coming in our business, airlines business. Because tourism we see is one area where we can also make investment and also sustain it through the foreign exchange earnings we make out of it. There are some other areas where we have been trying to be more liberal. That includes hydropower, that includes urban infrastructure, including transportation infrastructure. So this is an ongoing process. I think we'll try to see that these kind of constraints, sectoral reform constraints are duly addressed in due course of time. But some of the structural issues that are also of sectoral nature are financial constraints. In the financial sector, I think the World Bank report, the update, talks very well in terms of liquidity mismatch, balance sheet mismatch, how our long-term investment requirements fall short of the existing liquidity in the banking system, which is of the very short-term nature. We have to really match it. And the issue is why we don't want to raise long-term money from the market. It's only equity market which is growing. There is no bond market. And unless there is bond market, and if we really rely on short-term deposits in the banking system to invest for the long-term purposes, perhaps we fall in liquidity trap at most of the times. So this is time that we think about deepening the capital market, widening the bond market, and trying to develop new institutions which deal on long-term capital. And also in the equity market, we should be talking more about venture capital. For foreign investors, we have to be talking about hedge funds that we have started already working on and is in good progress. We are also trying to see that the Industrial Enterprise Act reflects the new federal structure and reflects the new business dynamics of this year at least. So amendment in the Foreign Investment Act, Foreign Investment and Technology Transfer Act, Bankruptcy Act, Anti-Dumping Act, which is also a kind of act necessary to safeguard our economy at the time of stress, and several other acts, including Foreign Exchange Act, are also in the offing. They might come to effect any time as the Parliament approves them. The institutional barriers, I think they are the major ones, and that includes ministries, that includes our regulatory bodies, and that includes our mentality and everything. And that includes values. Along with institutions, I also put our values, work culture, how fast we can deliver our decisions, that is fundamental. Our capacity to make quick decisions and rational decisions, effective decisions. This is also a process which takes time for us to develop and see that we are doing good institutional reform for better delivery of the decisions we have to make. One area which is not much talked in the Nepal development update is the external shocks that we have been getting and we are likely to get further. The global reversal of trade openness, the kind of trade protectionism, and we often call them trade war. How do we see the effect of trade war, quote unquote, in terms of our external sector implications, in terms of our exchange rate, and implications to the public spending coming from the shocks in the exchange rates, and also to our trade, and perhaps to our external labor market, and then to remittance. The report very, very rightly talks about how remittance have driven the growth through the consumption process. And now, Chimao, you very rightly pointed out how this is shifting from consumption-led to investment and productivity-led growth. Having said that, productivity-led growth is yet to come in force, but there is something happening in this direction. I think it is there that we have to do more and see that external shocks are at least minimum to the extent